Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. This is Poetry Part 2, The Critic's Craft. In other words, as readers and writers of poetry, this is what we have to do. Uh, Poems are short enough now to read more than once. So you read it once, as the instructions say here. Once you've read a poem and have a good literal understanding, that's steel. We went over that in lesson one. Um, Reread it to identify the tools that the poet has used. Uh, at the college level, just like you're expected to identify some of the rhetorical techniques in nonfiction that we've been reading. When it comes to poetry, you're expected to understand how some of the writer's tools are used. You'll also want to look for contrasts and shifts. So we'll look at uh, the critic's craft, your craft as a writer. This is part two. So the first part, we're going to use Robert Frost poem, Tree at My Window. I'll read it. You'll read along, and then you'll read it on your own. Tree at my window, window tree. My sash is lowered when night comes on, but let there never be a curtain drawn between you and me. Vague dream head lifted out of the ground, and the next most diffuse to cloud. Not all your light tongues talking aloud could be profound. But tree, I have seen you taken and tossed, and if you have seen me when I slept, you have seen me when I was taken and swept, and all but lost. That day she put our heads together. Fate had her imagination about her. Your head so much concerned with the outer, and mine with the inner weather. Okay, so now you look at this chart underneath here, all right, right across the top here. Whoops, too much, sorry. What the poet says, what the poet does, what the poet implies. These are all three things that you must write about, what you're going to have to address in your writing. So you're working down what the poet says. First reading, read for literal. Second, speaker, you're looking for the second point of view. So this first reading, what the poet says. Speaker and point of view, you identify who's speaking, the setting, characters, if there is one. Often, as I said in the last video, the speaker is a character, situation, and conflict, especially internal conflict. You're not always going to have a poem where there's going to be a conflict between characters. We will see one. We're going to write about one. Don't worry. I know you're not worried. Second time you read it, what does the poet do? Look for tools, structural tools, figurative language, metaphor, simile, things like that. Do a steal. Look for character details using steal. Look for ideas, words, structures that are repeated. Look at language that he uses. That doesn't mean English. That means word choices that the poet makes, or any other poetic techniques that you know, and we'll be reviewing plenty during the quarter. Don't worry. Last piece, what the poet implies, right? So what the poet does directly states, what the poet implies indirectly states, right? We were looking at that with our last essay. Third and more readings, you draw conclusions, make assertions. This is where you're asking questions. You're asking your analytical questions. Why and how? Why and how? Why did the poet make certain structural choices? Line breaks, stanzas, things like that. Why did the poet use any other poetic tools? How do the patterns of language contribute to meaning? Is there something when you read it, or when I read it, or when you hear the poet read it? Are they stressing different words or different sounds? What could that possibly mean? What assertions can you make? And how do poetic techniques, no matter what they are, no matter whether it's rhyme, whether it's meter, no matter what it is, how do they amplify meaning, right? Poems are meant to be read aloud. Amplification, right? You turn up the amps, you turn up the music, and you draw attention to meaning. Once you have wrapped your head around that table and you think you understand it, I want you to choose three pieces, three questions, one from each column, three from each column rather. So what the poet says, what the poet does, what the poet implies. Copy and paste them in this table down here and answer those questions for the Robert Frost poem. Got it? So you're using the Robert Frost poem and you're going to choose three ideas. One, two, three. Three ideas that fit the critic's